It's 4 p.m. and we're bringing you the developing news and the stories behind the headlines. This is Storycon. I'm Patrick Paez. Some of the stories we're watching this Wednesday, September 11. The U.S. Justice Department has declined to comment on a possible extradition for Pastor Apollo Quiboloy. The U.S. DOJ noted they do not generally comment on such matters until a defendant is on American soil. Quiboloy is wanted in the United States for alleged sex crimes and money laundering. The Senate sees no reason to grant dismiss Bambam Mayor Alice Go's request for an executive session. That's until she tells the truth in the next hearing. Meantime, COMELEC has extended to September 12 the deadline for Go's filing of counter affidavit for her misrepresentation case. The poll body said no further extensions will be allowed beyond this date. Former Immigration Chief Norman Tansinco thanked the President and his co-workers for his 2-year stint in the BID. Tansinco was dismissed over the former Bamban Mayor Alice Go's escape. Attorney Joel Anthony Viado is officer in charge of the Bureau until the President appoints a new commissioner. In the United States, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump showcase starkly different visions for the country as they face off for the first and what could be the last debate on the U.S. presidential elections. In this portion of the face-off, Harris tried to get under the skin of Trump, reminding him of his loss in the 2020 election and his supposed false claims.
Donald Trump was fired by 81 million people. So let's be clear about that. And clearly he is having a very difficult time processing that. But we cannot afford to have a president of the United States who attempts, as he did in the past, to upend the will of the voters in a free and fair election. And I'm going to tell you that I have traveled the world as Vice President of the United States, and world leaders are laughing at Donald Trump. I have talked with military leaders, some of whom worked with you, and they say you're a disgrace. And when you then talk in this way in a presidential debate and deny what over and over again are court cases you have lost because you did in fact lose that election, it leads one to believe that perhaps we do not have in the candidate to my right the temperament or the ability to not be confused about fact. That's deeply troubling, and the American people deserve better.
I'll give you 1 minute to respond, Mr. President.
Let me just say about world leaders. Viktor Orban, one of the most respected men, they call him a strong man. He's a tough person, smart. Prime Minister of Hungary. They said, why is the whole world blowing up? 3 years ago it wasn't. Why is it blowing up? He said, because you need Trump back as president. We're playing with World War III, and we have a president that we don't even know if he's... Where is our president? We don't even know if he's a president.
And just to clarify
they threw him out of a campaign like a dog. We don't even know. Is he our president? But we have a president,
Mr. President,
that doesn't know he's alive.
So I want to get your thoughts on support for Ukraine in this moment, but also, as Commander-in-Chief, if elected, how would you deal with Vladimir Putin, and would it be any different from what we're seeing from President Biden?
Well, first of all, it's important to remind the former president you're not running against Joe Biden, you're running against me. I believe the reason that Donald Trump says that this war would be over within 24 hours is because he would just give it up. Someone who cares about you and is not putting themselves first. I intend to be a president for all Americans and focus on what we can do over the next 10 and 20 years to build back up our country by investing right now in you, the American people.
So she just started by saying she's going to do this, she's going to do that, she's going to do all these wonderful things. Why hasn't she done it? She's been there for 3.5 years. They've had 3.5 years to fix the border. They've had 3.5 years to create jobs and all the things we talked about. Why hasn't she done it?
Okay, joining us today, Ana Marie Pamintuan, Editor-in-Chief of the Philippine Star and Storycon's resident political pundit, Ronald Llamas. Ana Marie, Ami, sorry.
Hi.
Good
Hi,
afternoon.
Patrick, Ronald.
Yes,
afternoon, Ami.
What's your take on this morning's debate between Harris and Trump? Pareho ba kayo ng opinion ni Ronald? Kasi kanina, medyo marami nagtampo sa kanya dahil tingin niya lamang si Trump sa nangyaring debate kanina. What's your take, Ami?
Mukhang na-rattle ng konti si Trump. It's unusual for him to be like that. Although pinag-uusapan nga ng mas maraming tao yung endorsement ni, ni Taylor Swift.
Ayun.
The childless cat lady. Malaking bagay yan. That's about, I think, about 8 million yan,
So maybe, I'll ask Ronald, so maybe after all that debating, that happened on television, on ABC News, what really mattered was what came after, which was the endorsement of Taylor Swift.
Yes.
Yan
Mahalaga yun.
ang
Mahalaga yun.
pinag-uusapan actually ng mga tao.
Mahalaga yun, yung endorsement ni Taylor Swift after the debate. At others like her. No? Others like her. Paano, ang pinagmamalaki ni Trump, si Elon Musk, na nag-endorse sa kanya. Ang sinasabi ko lang, Ami, dito sa debate kasi, ang pinagtatalunan dito ay 5 swing states at yung 3% na undecided dun sa 5 swing states. It's not about us, it's not about European voters, no, it's about American voters, specifically in that 5 swing states. At 2 doon sa swing states na yon ay nasa border. So, mahalaga sa kanila yung issue ng immigration at saka inflation.
Yes, inflation.
Yung isa ron, yung Pennsylvania, mahalaga sa kanya yung fracking, no? Yung energy. So, may kanya-kanya silang emphasis Depende doon sa swing state. At wag natin kalimutan, only 3% or even less dyan sa mga swing states na yan ang undecided. So, mananalo yung presidente on a razor-thin margin. No? Yan yung labanan. No? Tingin ko, popular vote, clearly panalo si Kamala. Pero ang labanan kasi rito ay yung
Electoral
college.
Yes.
Especially the swing states.
Which is a very complicated system that only America, the United States has. It's not majority vote, but who wins most electoral colleges.
Yes.
Mahabang paliwanagan, Ronald. Pero in short, parang ano yan kung sino nanalo sa isang state, kung ilang electoral college yan, winner take all. At least in most states, ganun ang sistema.
Kaya nga may
It's
strengths at
winner take all.
weaknesses ka. No? Ang strength ni Kamala, after nung debate with Biden, ay nagkaroon siya ng momentum, di ba? Pero merong mga bumps along the way. Dahil ang sinasabi, nagpi-flip-flop siya sa maraming issues. No? Sa fracking, sa Medicare, sa defunding the police, etc. No? Pero ganoon din naman si Trump nagpi-flip-flop din siya. No? Pero ang strength ni Kamala
He softened a bit on Obamacare. Di ba sabi niya, hindi na niya,
Yes.
wala siyang
ipapalit. Until may
ipapalit sa tutuloy lang niya.
Sa ngayon, ang meron siya ipapalit ay concept. No?
Concept
Not a plan. No? Kaya maganda itong debate that it will determine not only the future of the US, but it will affect the world.
Right.
Halimbawa, yung foreign policy, pinagtalunan nila, di ba? Yun ang banat ni Trump kay Kamala at kay Biden.
Maraming gera na
Afghanistan, natalo tayo, iniwan nyo hundreds of billions of military armaments. Tapos ngayon, Ukraine, ang laki ng gastos natin. Tapos ngayon, Gaza. Ang sabi niya, ang sabi ni Trump, pag manalo si Kamala, magkakaroon ng Third World War, a nuclear war. So talagang yung tira ni Trump fear, hate, emotions. Di ba? Yun yung balat niya. Immigration, nire-raid tayo ng 25 million illegal migrants na kinakain yung ating mga pusa at aso. Yung pets, di ba? So, ang target niya ay emotion. No? Si Kamala ay principles, values, unity. It's about the future, not about the past. Si Trump, ang focus niya is the past 3.5 years. No? Kaya nga ang balat niya ay yung incumbency. Kamala is Biden. Sinabi niya. Sabi naman ni Kamala, no, you are fighting against me. Kamala Harris, not Biden. So, titignan natin kung ano yung kanya.
And you were mentioning, Ronald, that medyo tali ang kamay ni VP Kamala Harris dito because she cannot criticize
her boss.
her boss, the
Her
President Biden.
Yeah.
No? And I just like to add, no, Ami, no, Ronald, now when they say that Kamala Harris, or Democratic candidate, is likely to win in the number of votes, okay, in majority
Popular votes,
in
yeah.
popular votes, it's because malakas traditionally ang Democrats sa mga populated centers.
Yes.
You're talking about California and New York
Yes.
City and the coastal states.
Mga
So,
centers.
ganon. Which has higher population.
Yeah.
So, ganon.
Pero ang inulit ko, you will win based on razor-thin margins in 5 swing states. No, yun yung labanan eh. No,
Again, the
Magiging
states
ano na
are...
naman yan,
this-
kapareho yan nung ano, kung sakasakali. Magiging kapareho yan ng first victory ni Trump.
yeah.
Right.
Di ba?
Right. Oo.
Nanalo ng milyon-milyon si Hillary Clinton sa popular vote.
Yes.
Pero pati si Trump nagulat. Siya ang naging presidente.
Pero kay Obama at kay Biden, nanalo sa popular vote at sa college at the same time.
Yes, both.
So when you're talking
Yes.
about states like swing states like Wisconsin, Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, these are not exactly highly populated areas, no? But and you were saying the issues for these states are likely to be immigration and inflation,
Yes.
which Trump may have
On message si Trump
may
dyan.
have dialed the number on. Kung
Yes,
magkakuha niya
yes,
ito
yes.
on those two issues.
Yes.
And speaking of Taylor
Correct.
Swift, Taylor Swift endorsement is exciting, okay? But it's not likely to convert votes that are not already for Kamala Harris. So would you agree?
Yes. Pero may kanya na. May followers siya ng mga 9, 10 million. no?
Yeah, pero
Yes.
I mean, you know,
Yeah.
may magsiswing pa ba because of a Taylor Swift endorsement? I mean, it's more likely na
Yes,
kung sino man ang dala ang hatak ni Taylor Swift, ayun na yun.
Kanya na, Democrats
Oo.
na.
Yung
nasa
mga ano,
Democratic
supporter
Party.
ng boyfriend niya.
Democrats na.
Karamihan doon. Di ba?
True,
Medyo
true.
Republican yan.
True, oo.
Yung mga supporter
Si
nun,
Travis
that's
Kelce,
ano, that's
the
I
football
think we
player.
can expect them to be Republican.
Right, right. Oh, that's possible. That's quite possible.
Unless si Kelsey endorse din si Kamala. Ayun.
Ayun, ang malaki talaga, no?
Okay, it would be good, Ami, Ronald, to hear views from some Filipino Americans.
Yeah.
Okay, let's bring into the discussion Gabriel Young. He's the secretary of a group in the United States called Filipino Young Professionals. Welcome to Storycon, Gabriel. Thank you for joining us again. Gabriel is a Democrat, for everybody who cares to know. So, Gabriel, what do you think about Ronald's assessment that, you know, Trump seems to have outperformed Kamala Harris in this morning's debate? This morning here in Manila.
I 100% absolutely disagree
There we
that
go.
Donald Trump outperformed Kamala Harris. And the reason behind that is that what we saw was Donald Trump was on the defensive actually most of the time. It was Kamala Harris who was on the offensive. However, where I think we are skewing it is by perception. Whereas Donald Trump's aggressive tone, his candor that he is a stronger leader, is what came off. Everything he spewed was very hate-fueled, very aggressive. He was targeting certain people. He was pointing the fingers out. Whereas Kamala Harris, being the lawyer that she is, was very diplomatic. And what I would say, see, is that there are two conceptions of leadership present. Kamala Harris is an inclusive leader, or views leadership as inclusive, where she wants to be a president for all people. Whereas Donald Trump, he wants to focus on the idea of bringing back an old America. For me personally, I believe that this old America is the one that's founded on racism that we've seen from the old Constitution in 1789 and the different Jim Crow laws and racist laws that have came ever since, but only until Democrats have came into play to repeal those. And so therefore, while Kamala Harris did not give that punchiness that people expect Trump to have delivered, I believe that Kamala Harris outperformed Donald Trump in being civil, in being knowledgeable about the policy, and also providing a path and framework for the future. Whereas Donald Trump only provided ones that he can claim from before.
I fully agree, Gabriel, with your points. And to clarify, I'm more pro-Kamala Harris. No, I have never been pro-Trump. I'm only saying is that Trump played the populist playbook. No, it's a playbook he's been using, and as I said, it's only a battle for those 5 swing states. Now, and those 5 swing states, it's a battle for the 3% undecided. It will be a razor-thin battle. No? And the strength of Kamala is that she is about values, about principles, no? About unity, about the future. But the populist playbook is also very compelling in a very polarized America. So, like 2 of the swing states are in the border. So, immigration will be an important issue for those 2 states, 2 swing states. So, what I'm saying is that Kamala wasn't able to destroy Donald Trump. Of course, it's a different debate from the Biden-Trump debate, much better. But I was expecting more in terms of destroying Trump from the side of Kamala.
So I guess, Gabriel, what Ronald's point is, if we're looking at those 5 swing states, he's arguing for the case that it seems that Trump may have connected with those 5 swing states more than Kamala Harris.
I'd argue otherwise, and the reason for that is that when we're talking about immigration, for example, whereas Trump has really focused on his plan to deport 11 million people in the United States, what we saw in the debate, embarrassingly enough, is that he could not answer if he had a plan or what that would look like. We saw the moderators press upon him. Are you going to have law enforcement go door to door? And instead, Donald Trump deflected that answer. And so what we saw also, similar to Donald Trump's healthcare question, was that he has concepts of a plan, but he doesn't actually have a plan. On the flip side, where Kamala Harris came to play with immigration, was she talked a lot about her own family being immigrants as well, and about the challenges that it's had, whereas Trump, again, has only highlighted the negatives of immigration. Plus, where Kamala Harris also did beat Trump, in my opinion, was the big focus that her assignment was to pursue that bipartisan immigration bill. However, where Vice President Harris really nailed it down was that Donald Trump's making calls to Congress to tell people to shut the bill down actually happened, and therefore the bill never came to fruition. There were multiple reports that it was a bipartisan bill, there was Republican support behind it, but Donald Trump killed the bill, and he did not answer why he killed the bill. He just then shifted the conversation and really showed that he does not have answers to the questions people want to know from him. All he wants to talk about is the number of people at her rallies, about being in Springfield and them eating dogs and cats. But Kamala Harris actually talked about that she would want to either reintroduce that plan that was discussed, but also throw in her own spin on it as well. Whereas Donald Trump, again, has absolutely nothing. And therefore, I think if voters want answers, they will find it in Kamala Harris. However, when we're talking about these swing state voters as well, I think there's one thing important to recognize is that within these swing states, there are also a lot of disenfranchised and disengaged voters. And I think that's where the tipping point is, where they would want answers to their own questions. However, those voters who probably either A, would want to find and seek the truth, would find it in Kamala Harris, or B, would want to dive into simplistic narratives that they can only see themselves and therefore would go for Trump. And what we're seeing right now is a vote for registering those voters, and the more that you can outreach to those voters as well. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that it wasn't exactly tipping point for Trump, but it's more so how were you able to reach the narrative that people were watching at home? And I think both were reaching 2 different narratives that are playing in households in those swing states, and therefore it's inconclusive to say that one outperformed the other in the swing state constituencies.
But Gabriel, to Ronald's point, is there strong concern among Democrats, you think, that we are seeing a repeat of what happened when Donald Trump faced off with Hillary Clinton? Because as Ronald pointed out, Kamala might win the popular vote, but we might all be surprised again with a Trump victory in the Electoral College.
To add to Ami, Gabriel, again, I agree with you. No, Trump is a liar. Trump has no plan. No, but Trump caters to emotions. hate,
Yeah.
fear, Third World War, no, illegal invasion, no, etc., etc. As we all observed this past decade, that has some traction. No, that's the problem. Will voters be intelligent enough, no, to look beyond the lies, to look beyond the absence of a plan, to look beyond emotions, especially in those 5 swing states?
Definitely. So going back to the question of, Amy, could you repeat your question one more time? I had it at the top of my head.
No.
Yeah. You think we're seeing a repeat? We might see a repeat of what happened when Hillary Clinton faced off with Trump. We were surprised that she won the electoral vote, the popular vote, millions, and suddenly here's Trump. He becomes president based on the electoral vote. People are talking about this again, this scenario, after watching the debate. Is there a strong concern within the Democratic, Filipino community of Democrats? Is there a strong concern that this might happen again? Are we seeing this again?
Yes, there is 100% a fear amongst Democrats right now that another Clinton incident might happen. And particularly what we saw in 2020 were the disenfranchised of those who didn't like either Trump or Hillary Clinton, not 2020, going back to 2016, they didn't like Trump or Hillary, and so they didn't vote at all. And what we saw despite that popular vote was that in states such as Florida, it allowed Trump voters to prevail and therefore have the electoral college swing in Trump's favor. When in reality, I know you all were talking about population centers earlier. Yeah. That popular vote was really in full force for Hillary. So there is that real full fear. But I think that's what is different 8 years later this time around. That those same people who are disenfranchised are now recognizing the impacts of their disenfranchisement. I'm not necessarily putting the blame on those voters, but there's a new conversation that's happening in the United States. For example, when we look at the Israel-Gaza example, we see that many voters are afraid of wanting to go either Trump knowing that he's pro-Israel, but also going to Kamala knowing that she's a little pro-Israel, but also still pro-Palestine. So on the question of will people be willing to look to the facts, I think people are starting to become more civically engaged because we saw what happened in 2016 with Hillary Clinton. And therefore, there are many people amongst the youth, amongst my age group, who are actually willing to look to the facts now, whereas those who are older voters, whether that be boomers or Gen Xers, tend to be phasing out of the voting demographic, and therefore young people tend to be the decision-making votes now, or let alone minority people of color who are recognizing that they really do have a stake, that they're actually wanting to be enfranchised again to actually vote, and therefore are willing to look at the facts rather than buy into the misinformation, disinformation.
So Gabriel, the needle is changing towards Hillary. That was your point, because they've learned from the Hillary defeat before. But the problem is the polls I saw in this swing states is that 75% of the concern is about inflation and about immigration in all the 5 states. 75%. The strength of Kamala, for example, about reproductive health, is not reflected in the polls. It's a very small consideration. Political extremism is about 20-25%. No, gun control is about 20%, and the question about reproductive health, healthcare, which is the strength of Kamala, is not very high in the swing states. Will this debate change that?
I definitely think it'll change that because what we saw again was that Kamala had the plan, but then Donald Trump just didn't. And while there were so many issues to go forth, I think it was also on the performance as well, that while Kamala didn't emphasize it as much, is that she still had the plan. And what I'm also seeing from the Kamala campaign versus the Trump campaign is that they're going out into these swing states and making sure that folks are educated within the policy portfolios that Kamala's talked about, whether that be inflation and immigration. Primarily today, one thing that really excited about that the Harris Waltz campaign did is they released a fact sheet for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, and they're now doing their best to develop fact sheets for each state so that whenever they go into these states, they can actually read about the issues that are impacting them. And so with inflation and immigration from this debate, while inflation wasn't a huge topic or explicitly stated, Kamala Harris did advertise her Opportunity Economy Plan, which talked about the benefits that voters in the swing states can pursue with that $6,000 child tax benefit, or with the small business side of things, the $125,000 tax credit as well. How much will that resonate with people in the swing states? I think that is yet to be seen. However, it is already out there that, again, Trump doesn't have a plan, so at least voters in the swing states are able to decide whether they want to vote for someone with a plan or vote for someone based on their emotions. And the demographics of these swing states, again, these border states, they tend to be mixed amongst the electorate. They tend to favor older boomers who are there for retirement, such as looking at Texas, and people who don't want to pay income tax. But then there's also a growing electorate of youth, Gen Z, who are moving the needle towards Kamala and doing their best to fight the misinformation, disinformation on social media. There's currently candidates right now, actually a Filipino American candidate over in Texas who is doing just that in her campaign for the state house. And so that's why I am a strong believer that, again, the youth and those who will be looking for a plan, who are the new upcoming generation of voters, will definitely fill in that gap where the older voters are voting on their emotions.
Okay, Gabriel, where does the Filipino, how is the Filipino community divided in this election? Can you give
Definitely.
us a picture or an idea?
Or are there surveys
Yeah.
expressing that division?
Definitely. So for one, in my own academic study, I conducted my own survey in partnership with a nonprofit called Lead Filipino that measured where Philams lie on the political spectrum from last year. Although it might be 1 year old, what we found was that, again, those who tended to be older Philams, or those who are more first or second gen immigrants, tend to be on the conservative side, whereas the youth and those whose families have been here in the U.S. for fourth and fifth generations tend to be on the liberal side of things. And so how that's playing out here is that what we're seeing is on the West and East Coast, there's the heavy Democrat presence that is both young and old, whereas on these flyover states, the Midwest, it remains up for grabs due to the feelings of wanting to belong. Moreover on that, so back in 2020, there used to be Philams for Biden and there used to be Philams for Trump. But this year what we're seeing is that on the Democrat side, there was a stronger organization of Filipino Americans in coalition with Republicans for Harris, who are pushing back against a Donald Trump presidency. And what we see is that there's a high sway and movement towards the Harris Waltz camp, with more Filipino American DNC delegates than there ever were GOP delegates this year. And so therefore many Filipino Americans are starting to lean towards the DNC out of fear that another Trump presidency will do more harm to the country than good.
Okay, what is the appeal?
Ibrahim, would you have any specific numbers? Would you have any specific numbers among Filipino Americans? How many are Democrats and how many are Republicans? Because we get the impression that there are more actually who are Republican. Is that an accurate perception?
Even in just indicative, not
Yes.
you don't have to,
A ballpark figure. Yeah.
A ballpark. Give me 1 second, because there is this organization called AAPI Data and APIA
Yep.
Vote, and they held an exit vote survey on where people lie on the spectrum of their pool of candidates. So I'm pulling that up right now. But from previously in the 2020 election, what we saw particularly, okay, here I have the numbers. What we saw was that around 60% of Filipino Americans tended to be Democrat, whereas there's around 20 or 30% who tended to be Republican, and then there's this 10% undecided. Okay, so in their most updated voter survey, with a sample pool of 2,479 respondents, 45% of those who identify as Filipino tend to be Democrat. with 21% as independent, 28% as Republican, and then 3% as an other party, and 2% as a don't know. So what we're seeing is that Filipino Americans are starting to lean more Democrat over time. And while this is just a sample poll survey, it's a decent reflection of where the overall population is looking at for Phil-Ams.
Okay, what is it about Trump, Gabriel, that appeals to, you mentioned a while ago, that appeals to older generation of Phil-Ams? And I'll ask you at the same time, na rin, what is it about Kamala Harris or the Democratic Party that appeals to a younger generation of Phil-Ams? Because that seems to be the division where the line is drawn.
And added to that, Gabriel, is what is the 21% independent? Because usually there's no independent candidate. If there is, it's a marginal independent candidate. So what does independent preference mean in your survey?
So in this it's not my survey. It is APIA vote and AAPI data survey. So these results can be found online. And what that translates to is this survey was more measuring party identification than actually which candidate you're going to vote for. And as we all know, people tend to vote with the parties that they identify with. And so there are certain states, such as here in California, where you can register as an independent, but then you can still vote either blue or red. So it's really an up in the grabs answer. So to the previous question about why are older generations tending to lean more Trump versus younger generations towards Kamala, is because of the generational experiences and probably immigration experiences. A lot of older generational Filipino Americans bought into the American dream and the pull yourself by your bootstraps idea that anyone can make their American dream happen. However, on the younger generation side, what we're seeing is that American dream is really false. And we're seeing that with that inflation, the high rates of housing prices these days, and let alone the unaffordable cost of living. And so the older generation tends to complain that young people don't know how easy they have it, whereas there's so many resources available. And that's what they buy into with the Trump campaign, is that there's this want to make America great again, that idea that anyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. However, on the younger side of things, especially with the culture education that's presented to Filipino Americans from ethnic studies and the Third World Liberation Movement, we're seeing that there's this critical thought that America, as built as a racist country, is inherently broken as an institution and doesn't enable that social mobility that older generations say so. So there's that little clash between older generations and class that is coming to the forefront. That younger people feel that because things are so unaffordable that they don't have a place in society, that they find a place in the Democratic Party that aligns with the Filipino American identity, that has the history of labor issues that Filipino Americans have fought for, or then immigration that Filipino Americans have also fought for as well. Whereas on, again, the Republican older generational side, that since they were able to make it, regardless of their own identities and the issues that were at the forefront of the Filipino American historical movements, that they want to buy into the racially blind party, if you will.
How about reproductive health, Gabriel? Especially for Filipino Americans, because Filipino Americans are very Catholic, very religious, and reproductive health is the strength of the Democrats, of Kamala. But is this strength reflected in the Filipino community? Because whenever I'm there in the US, that's an issue which some Filipino Americans are raising against the Democrats about abortion, about reproductive health. So how is that playing in the Filipino American community?
I'd say it's another generational conversation. So a lot of the first-gen immigrants who carry the beliefs over from the Philippines, particularly that Catholicism belief, still believe in that single-issue voting stance of being pro-choice versus pro-life. However, what we see is that their children, the first-generation Americans or the second-gen Filipino Americans, are the ones who tend to lean towards the reproductive health side of things. One anecdote that I can share is that when Filipino American gangs were really prevalent within the United States, particularly if you look at Cerritos, California, for example, teen pregnancy was a huge conversation and occurrence for Filipino American women. And however, it's those reproductive health issues of those who recognize the opportunity to choose about their own bodies and break away from the old Filipino notions and within the Catholic Church, we're able to recognize that, and therefore why second gen and third generation Filipino Americans tend to lean more into the reproductive health side of things than first generation Filipino Americans. Another thing on the first generation side of things, I believe there's also a split now. What we see a lot within the Filipino Americans for Harris community is that the first gen Filipino Americans are now a majority women as well, and those women who are recognizing that their beliefs are really founded within the Catholic Church and then within the old beliefs of the Philippines, recognize that they actually have an opportunity and choice in the United States, and therefore why some of them are breaking away and now joining more so on the Democrat side, because these women can see themselves in the party that feels that a party represents them and their own issues.
Okay.
Gabriel, are the Filipino Americans active voters? I mean, is the turnout typically high among the Filipino Americans during elections?
During elections, no. So a lot of Filipino Americans tend to be disenfranchised or tend to be very disengaged, especially first generation Filipino Americans, especially that a lot of us carry that cultural trauma that being civically engaged has, or we don't see ourselves being argued in the policy that the candidates are arguing. And so therefore, what we're seeing now amongst this generation, there's this new article that came out from NBC Asian America that says that Asian American as a whole, voter registration rates are rising, and the Filipino American population is a part of that as well. And so there are a lot of movements to go out into communities. There's actually a lot of grant funding also for nonprofits to go out into these communities, register voters, particularly also Filipino Americans, and making sure that they're turning out at the polls and improving the low turnout rates from before.
Is this election, Gabriel, also polarizing the Filipino community? I mean, we just had an election in 2022, and we saw divisions, deep divisions, and polarization among even Filipino families. So, does this election have the same polarizing and divisive effect on Filipino families, on the Filipino community?
Yes, it definitely does. And I can even speak from personal experience. I have people on both sides of the spectrum. I was raised conservative. I became liberal over time. And so a lot of my family itself is feeling its own polarization, and transforming that into the larger community magnifying glass is that we're seeing that across the board. However, what is different about this year versus 2020 is the organization strategies. As I mentioned before, there is no Filipino Americans for Trump and Vance, but there's Filipino Americans for Harris Waltz, and then also Filipino Americans in the coalition of Republicans for Harris who are joining there. And so while there is that polarization on the ground within our own communities, we're not seeing that reflected in the actual organization, or political organization, I should say, that is elevating upwards and doing the fundraising strategies. So what we're seeing there's a lot of Filipino Americans who are actually out fundraising for Kamala Harris, and then there actually is Filipino Americans fundraising and door knocking and canvassing for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance.
Okay, Gabriel, this is the second presidential debate for this elections in November. Of course, the first one was with President Biden.
And possibly the last.
We're just curious here. The perspective from Manila is that U.S. elections are all about the effect on our dispute with China, for example, and yet we notice that there are no questions on China. Is this because, as far as China is concerned, there's no disagreement between Republican parties and the Democratic Party, or is this because it's a non-issue as far as the American public is concerned?
Because about a couple of months ago, Trump said that he won't defend Taiwan if he's president militarily. And Biden said 2 years ago that he will defend Taiwan militarily.
And yet, Ronald, it's nowhere. All this is China is not
part of the debate. No,
it's not part of the debate.
Ukraine was, Afghanistan partly,
Gaza
is, but not much mention about
China,
the hub of the world, the South China Sea. No, the conflict between the two biggest economies and the two biggest armies in the world, no? Which
So
is
what's the public sentiment in the American public and in American media? Is this a bias of the American media, or there's really no sentiment in as far as the American public is concerned?
It's not a
non-issue.
voting issue.
Yes.
Is there bias or is there sentiment? I believe there is sentiment amongst the American public, but there is a lot of media bias. Right now, what we're seeing also on these voter issues is that people are really putting the magnifying glass over the Ukraine-Russian war and Israel-Gaza because of the budget that is going to that. When we're talking about all these other government programs that aren't being funded, we're seeing that it's on the flip side, the Department of Defense is selling millions and millions of dollars into going into Ukraine and also Israel-Gaza. On the flip side, the China issue and Asian security is not a hot war. It's currently a Cold War
Not
that
a
is still
hot war.
festering
Yeah.
in people's minds, and therefore why I wouldn't say that Democrats and Republicans agree about it, because as you all mentioned, Donald Trump, albeit during his presidency, was very adamant about defending Taiwan, has switched his stance now, saying that he wouldn't defend Taiwan, and particularly out of fear for the economic impacts that would have. Additionally, what we saw under a Trump presidency was the high tariffs towards China that caused many supply chain issues that eventually came up during COVID-19, whether that be with getting masks, with getting information about the COVID-19 virus. Donald Trump stowing that soft tension between China and the US has really sparked the inability to communicate. And we even see a similar conversation within the Democratic Party as well, whereas during APEC a few months ago in San Francisco, President Joe Biden on record said that he still sees Xi Jinping as a dictator despite having a productive lunch and conversation with him. So while both Democrats and Republicans do agree that China is an issue, it's not the number one issue because we don't see the budgets being poured over for a hot war over there. However, what I do agree with you all on is that is an area that I'm very disappointed on, that U.S.-Asia relations aren't at the forefront of voters right now, and especially knowing that China, with being the second biggest economy in the world, is coming after the U.S.'s throne at number one, is an issue that definitely people should pivot on. But it's just not a hot topic right now within the polls or anything. I think another issue with talking about China as well has been the rise in anti-Asian hate as well, and so both parties don't know necessarily how to conduct messaging around it that is culturally sensitive, or that voters will care about. Currently, all the other voter bases don't really care about China, but then the Asian American base does. However, Asian Americans, such as myself, still feel invisible at times when both parties are presenting their foreign policy plans. And so what is one area that I believe that either campaign can improve on is definitely addressing the U.S.-Asia relations and security issue, and that will definitely be an issue that many Asian Americans, including the Filipino American community, can latch on to in the future. Especially that a lot of young Phil-Ams are really interested in foreign affairs and how the U.S.'s trade relations and bilateral relationship with the Philippines impacts their own cultural upbringing here in the U.S.
Okay, I guess we should take that as something good that it was not discussed in the debate, because that means it's not a big problem, right? We should take that as a positive.
Last question, Gabriel.
Yeah.
No? Trump said that if he doesn't win, there will be blood in the streets. No? So, in a way, it's a message that January 6th incident will be much bigger if he doesn't win this election. No? How much of a threat is that in American society? This is the first time that the problems of America, like January 6th, happened in America. It used to happen back here. It used to happen with the third world, with the global south.
People are saying it's a banana republic.
Now it's happening
it's
in
looking
the
like a
US.
banana republic.
The decision of the Supreme Court to give the president immunity from almost anything is something defining nowadays. So this threat of Trump, if he wins, he become authoritarian. If he loses, there will be blood in the streets. Is this real?
Yes, there's a very real fear that with with not electing Donald Trump back into office, that there wouldn't be another peaceful transition of power. We saw that within the debate as well. The moderators asked, the election is in 56 days, and would you participate in a peaceful transition of power? And Donald Trump did not answer that fully at all. He instead blamed again Nancy Pelosi, DC Mayor Muriel Bowser, and everyone else for not ordering the National Guard to come in, when in reality, while it wasn't fact-checked on ABC, the National Guard can only be ordered through the Department of Defense, which can only be ordered from the Commander-in-Chief. And so Trump had every opportunity to do so on January 6th, and therefore every claim that he talked about that January 6th was a peaceful transition is falling false on deaf ears. Whereas Kamala Harris, who talked about being at the Capitol at January 6th, that there is that real sentiment that it can happen again, that there is a huge fear that with the racial divide in America that it can happen again. And whether that we see with the division that Trump was infusing in the debate with blaming immigrants and then encouraging people to quote unquote take back their country through making America great again, that there's a fear that there won't be a peaceful transition of power and that there actually may be a bloodbath. Additionally, referencing the bloodbath too, Trump talked about getting rid of people within the government who doesn't align with him. And I know Project 2025 was a small talking point tonight, and while Trump does try to distance himself from it, the policy of kicking people out within government and replacing them with his own presidential appointees is already an idea from Project 2025 that he has already started considering, while he didn't outright say that it was. And so this bloodbath of removing people who disagree with him, figuratively, a figurative bloodbath, is something that he's even considering to reshape Washington, D.C. and quote-unquote drain the swamp of what he sees. And so there is that fear that it's not just going to be a peaceful, violent transition that might lead to political violence and families fighting against each other once again, but also within our own government, that he is able to reshape the entire government to make sure that it can look into something more that falls in line with this political philosophy than anything else.
Okay, Ami?
April, after this final debate, after this debate, are you expecting a third and final one to happen? Is it more unlikely now, or are you still saying one more?
I want to be very optimistic that a third debate will happen, but I am feeling a bit pessimistic and cynical because of how hard it was to even get Donald Trump on the debate stage. Once the campaign shifted from Biden to Harris, we saw that Donald Trump at first was saying that he doesn't want to debate Kamala Harris because he didn't view her as the proper candidate. And so looking forward now as we near into November, I would really like to hope that there's a third opportunity for both of them to go at it again, but then also shed more light or even a spotlight to a vice president debate where we could see J.D. Vance go up against Governor Tim Walz and see where it's more on the policy front of things, away from the national spotlight and personalities that take up Kamala and Trump, and that we can see a more concrete policy debate at play.
Okay, Gabriel, you're a Democrat. Was there something you would have wanted to hear or hear Kamala Harris say in the debate earlier today?
I don't think she responded stronger enough to Trump talking about her own race and identity, with her deciding and transforming to be black, because I think that is something that she knows, and definitely the Democratic Party and people have that education to know that you don't choose the race that you are, you just so happen to be it. And so by Kamala not taking a stronger stance towards protecting racial identity and eventually how that has its impacts on civil rights is something that I wish that she definitely would have taken a stronger stance on, especially in the wake for us Asian Americans, as we're seeing that the Supreme Court's case against affirmative action and with it being struck down, race is such a prevalent conversation within the liberal community that we hope that President Harris would speak so. Or Vice President Harris. One of the big issues that we saw with the Obama administration, for example, was that while he was the first black president, he didn't speak for all black communities, especially the socioeconomic disadvantaged ones that were impacted by racially unjust policy in the past. So for Harris to come back and make sure that she is making her policy to address racial inequities much more, that would be such a pivot point.
Okay. Thank you for joining the Storycon today. Gabriel Young of the U.S. group Filipino Young Professionals, live from Berkeley, California. Thank you, Gabriel.
Gabriel. Hope to see you again back here.
Thank you. Hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Okay, thank you for joining the Storycon today. Ami Pamintuan, Editor-in-Chief of the Philippine Star, and Ronald Llamas, our resident political pundit. Join us again tomorrow at 4 p.m. for the Storycon. I'm Patrick Paez. We are One News, all sides, all the time. This is the Story Conference Group, or the Storycon Group.